Our guest speaker this evening, Mr. Chris Way, holds a BA from Houghton College in Intercultural Studies and International Development, with concentrations in linguistics and psychology. Upon graduating in 2012, Chris served with AmeriCorps in 2013, concentrating on economic development and completing a business plan for the Atinga Project, which he's going to speak about this evening. The Atinga Project won a Startup Weekend Award sponsored by the Kauffman Foundation, which provided a 2-year website and legal services. For 2 years after careful market research and strategic branding, the project organized shipments of the artisans' tire sandals to America, selling both locally in Buffalo, New York, and online. Atinga has become a social enterprise leveraging small-scale free enterprise to help alleviate poverty. Chris currently works as a small business counselor for Westminster Economic Development Initiative, a nonprofit microfinance institution. He focuses on providing pre-loan technical assistance for entrepreneurs, growing small, medium-sized enterprises, and other new or established local businesses. We are honored to have him join us this evening. The title of his lecture is Dignity, Honor, and Humility: Fighting Paternalism and Poverty in Africa with Entrepreneurship. Please welcome Chris.
So tonight, yes, we're going to look at the Atinga Project. Atinga means dignity, honor, and humility. It's a West African, historically West African term that is mainly used to describe the peasantry or the working class, the economic class. We're going to kind of review a little bit about where that came from and why we named our footwear Atingas, and also look into the local context of how we operate in Rwanda and how it is very important to be sensitive to that local context. I also want to bring up a few issues that we are encountering in our small social business. We're going to look at the policy issues that are currently causing problems for exporting this footwear, and why that's a case for us to focus more on the local market and the potential to support the artisans that we work with there. And ultimately, I think, as you'll see with this quote from Jacqueline Novogratz, we believe that dignity is truly more important to the human spirit than wealth. Through our product, we want to practice and promote more so dignity and uphold dignity of the human person, especially as it relates to our producers. And we do that also in our product and in the overall paradigm that I will share with you tonight. So first off, these are the artisan shoemakers that we work with and their families, basically. We started with 3 artisan shoemakers that make tire sandals, which is basically Africa's most humble and most common shoe. You find that in many different African countries. It's a very strong, durable, and affordable piece of footwear. And we worked with 3 artisan shoemakers to start, but quickly found, of course, behind them their wives and the women and the children of their families that make this project all the more richer. Diving right in, tonight I'd like to kind of stand in between basically two paradigms that we've uncovered over the years. We are not just a business, but we are very much so applying many of the theories of international development that I studied in college. And I went to Houghton College. It's out east, a Christian liberal arts school, and graduated in 2012. And I found that as I graduated and moved to Buffalo to serve with AmeriCorps, very quickly my eyes were opened up to free enterprise and what it was doing, not just locally in front of me, but all around the world, just completely unlocking the potential of people globally. This was at a time when globalization was, and as it still is, growing and changing very quickly with many different technologies. And I found that was starting to unlock my own potential. And I started studying more. I actually went back to school just to brush up on business more formally. And that was because we had found our approach. We wanted to use business very simply to take the profits that we could generate from the sale of the tire sandals that we saw great market potential for in the US and plow those profits right back into the business to grow it as best as we can. And we're still doing that to this day. Later, I'll reference Muhammad Yunus, who actually makes a delineation between social enterprise and social business. And I should be more careful about this because he's very right that in a social enterprise setting, these have existed for a while, and owners can actually take a dividend or a draw on the profits in a social enterprise. But what distinguishes a social enterprise from a social business is an arrangement or a company in which the owners choose not to draw on that profit, but rather put that back into the purpose of serving the beneficiaries that we work with or that a company works with. So tonight, you'll notice that in our development approach on that side of things, we're very local, we're beneficiary-led and beneficiary-based, and we really have focused on mutual learning together. In terms of the business model, some of the things that I'm really not going to go into much depth on because this is more of a focus on development. We had a very minimalist approach with our business design. Missional branding, we baked very clearly the values of what we were promoting and what we stood for into the product. So you'll see that as we continue. But first, I'd like to step back and look at the context in which we are kind of all operating, whether it's global or local. And this comes from Poverty Inc. Poverty Inc. Is a fantastic documentary that I cannot recommend enough. If I could, I would have loved to make it a prerequisite before this talk. Poverty Inc. essentially really takes a look at and exposes some of the issues with the foreign aid system, which ultimately originated with colonialism and obviously trying to offset some of the damage done politically, economic, socially throughout the years. And this is one of the quotes that they use, as you can see. This is one of the struggles that anyone, whether you're operating in the public sector or the private, or outside, or whatever your attempt may be to influence and bring about change, sometimes we run into certain issues. And as I said, we'll look at some of those issues very soon. Furthermore, just some statistics to kind of set the tone. 82% of global wealth generated in 2017 went to the richest 1% of the population. I also have two just quick statistics here from George Aite's book, Africa Unchained. This is where Atinga actually began. I was a senior in a governance and development class with Dr. Ron Okerson, who worked very closely with Eleanor Ostrom. She won the 2009 economic Nobel Prize for economics. One of the things we were looking at in his book, Africa Unchained, was trying to understand not just the many case studies that he presented and really focused on each African nation, but trying to understand, again, why were so many schemes to improve the human condition failing, and hearing from Aite, a Ghanaian economist himself, who also was very much in tune with the traditional structures in place. That was the core focus of Atinga, and when he introduced Atinga in this book, he helped us to understand that this was basically the approach that would help us to focus on our enterprise. Now, I studied also in West Africa in Sierra Leone. I was fortunate enough to have some experience on the ground with the Mango Project there. And I studied under Dr. Ron Okerson to learn how in the rural areas of most of these countries, there is an indigenous and traditional intact governance framework. There are always you find these operating on the ground. And in order to get ground level, it takes a lot of research to understand how these systems operate and how people traditionally operate. The big disconnect especially when it comes to foreign aid, is that the leadership that is often centralized in these countries are, as we know, disconnected from the Atinga. And that's what George Ayite brought to us and helped us to realize that. And we also were able to do that and realize that in our study abroad. I studied in Rwanda with the GoEd study abroad program in 2011, and I then started to put some pieces together and see this disconnect for myself. I'd like to have us just focus tonight on, again, that there's more to life than money. And especially in a small enterprise, when you're working with people in different cultures, especially when there's sensitive issues at stake, this is really the core focus of Atinga. And I'd like to just give a background now on the project and how it started. You might keep hearing me say we, that I'm referring to myself and my co-founder at the time. She was Congolese at the time and now is American. Princess and I worked together to do the foundational research and do just what I was referring to, like we did in Sierra Leone. We worked with the artisans on the ground. We wanted to collect the baseline research and learn how these artisan shoemakers operated. I returned after my study abroad with a pair of these sandals, and I just saw such potential in them that I knew that, frankly speaking, all of my friends that were wearing Toms at the time, they were kind of the epitome of this disconnect, at least on the international level. And so I said to a Princess, let's name them Atingas, and she completely agreed, and we then proceeded to, I went to Buffalo and we graduated. She went to serve in Rwanda, in Kigali, and she was working with the GoEd study abroad program and was able to work with 3 artisan shoemakers. You can see some of them pictured right here. And she was able to get the initial research that set the foundation for our work. The thing that stood out to me the most was how these artisans were excluded, not necessarily from the global market, but even in their own society. They, in their own words, would say that they were outcasts, that they were rejected. These are some of the words that really stuck out to me and were weighed heavy on my heart when we got this research. And so to start to look at how Americans that were buying into certain imagery and certain media that made them feel like they were doing a lot of good for a country, and then wearing a product that was handmade and benefiting, with every purchase, these kind of artisans, that was really what hit me square in the heart and in the head. So you can see now, this is later, as we sold their footwear. This is thankfully a different reaction that they've had. Still looking at the context here, this is a screenshot from Poverty Inc. that I think very aptly describes a little bit of not only the current aid system, and in Poverty Inc. they refer to it as the global poverty industry, because as you can see the kind of the trickle effect. The green represents basically the aid that reaches the beneficiary at the bottom. Unfortunately, you can see that it's not necessarily what you would expect and not what we intend, probably, in most cases. In our model, we sought to basically, and this was done prior to learning about that aid context and how bad it really looked, but we wanted to give the artisan shoemakers direct access to the international market. You can see on this side, that's the USA on this side, and then Rwanda on the other side. You can see that the Atinga artisan shoemakers, we set up a small export company, Atinga Ltd, would produce their own sales just as they do on a daily basis. And this is a really important point that we'll talk about a little later. But they have local sales in their local market. And that is basically a sustainable thing for them every day. However, when we work with them and export and work with a fair trade at a fair trade premium, and our D for D, which is a dividend for development, which I will explain soon, they saw their income rise significantly. We'll look at those numbers soon, but this just shows the how we operate, basically, and it's updated basically to date. So I mentioned D for D. This is a core piece of our model. The dividend for development, it's basically 30% of every sale is what it works out to, goes back directly, and you can see that this is basically from left to right. We put dignity back in their hands with this D for D, basically, in terms of upholding their right to choose. We don't choose for them. A lot of past approaches were more top-down, and they weren't beneficiary-led. One thing that George Ayite really kind of helped us understand, along with another nonprofit that I'm going to mention shortly, is that the real decision-making is best left to the beneficiary. And we really believe this, not just in, it's not just a value that we have, but we've seen this now in our research. And it's corroborated by many others. And this is just a quick shot of Princess. And you can see again, our core focus at the outset was to change perceptions through this footwear to help to challenge the misperception and misconceptions that people had of Africans, and that they're helpless, that they're needy, which is so common in the media that we see. And I mentioned that the other influence that greatly directs even our project to this day is Give Directly, which was a nonprofit that started out in 2008, founded by Michael Fay and Paul Nyhouse. They actually decided to put their graduate studies on hold and do what nobody else was doing, which was give direct mobile money transfers, cash transfers, meaning linking a donor here in the US directly to a recipient in Kenya, and first it was Kenya, also in Uganda. And what they found was that, though there was a lot of skepticism at first, they found that the people that received these cash transfers, they knew what they needed and could apply them to their most pressing needs. They knew how to meet their needs because, again, they're on the local level. There wasn't a plan or a project to fund. This money went directly to the beneficiaries. This greatly influenced us at the outset of our project, because we knew that this was something we needed to adopt and actually study. And from what we could tell early on with our research, the artisan shoemakers knew exactly the same thing: how to meet their needs for their family, obviously, which included better nutrition, school fees to keep their kids in school, just reinvesting in their local market needs and their own businesses at the local market, and other activities that they applied that to. And again, that was what we called the dividend for development. Now, patient capital plays a huge role also. Abulin, Dr. Sellers mentioned that we did start out with a small award from the Kauffman Foundation for pitching our project, and that was at a startup weekend that eventually then led to a Kickstarter campaign, and we raised about $13,000 in order to invest and into the project and get it off the ground, to conduct the sensitization meetings that we needed to export the first batches of footwear to the US. Patient capital, this is Jacqueline Novogratz of Acumen Fund. That has been another big influence on our project and on the way that we operate. A lot of business, you might, even those who have heard of social businesses, those who are studying business or have been in business really don't understand at all why we would want to take a model, and invest patiently and not reap an immediate reward and maximize profits right away. But when you're doing development work, when you're actually working and interfering, honestly, with the lives of people in a different context other than your own, it's very important to go basically step by step with them and let them lead the process. These are the core things that then guided our process in Atinga. You could see that, again, it's back kind of to that hand in hand. On the left, we have the Atinga development model, but on the left, our business model. And we had some core values that guided us in both ways, but you can kind of see how it flows. That we started with an initial posture towards poverty, which I was taught on the Go-Ed study abroad program in Rwanda, that poverty is not just a lack of material things or financial things, but it is really multifaceted in itself. Sometimes poverty takes the form of, many different things, that actually somebody that is materially rich can be just as poor, either spiritually or emotionally or in other ways, as somebody else. And this was an important thing because, again, when we interviewed the artisans and listened to them, it was apparent they felt the same way as anyone else that would be excluded. And again, like they said, they're outcast, rejected. They wanted to know, why would we be interested in working with them? Why would we want to take a chance like that? That was really because we valued authentic relationships, person-centered relationships. That's Carl Rogers that we applied in theory to the everyday of this project and the in and outs of this project. So we worked together over 2014 to 2018. We just found the right outlets for sales in the US, and that was a little bit of wholesale and retail, but we found out surprisingly that festivals in the summertime were our most successful and sustainable way to sell these sandals, at least on a small scale. We're still working on that as we grow, but that has become kind of how we adapted, because the artisans also sell on a small scale. So we actually kind of learned from them, not just how to sell the product, but how to actually use some tools to customize the product to people and our customers that would come and try them on. So we would learn together. Mutual learning is kind of a key aspect of it too. We started with the value that everyone had something to teach and everybody has something to learn. So that's a little bit of the Atinga Project and how we started. What we have learned recently is that, again, each country that people are operating in, whether it's in business or just locally inside of a country, you have policies that you have to deal with. And in the year 2000, AGOA, which is the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, was instituted and by the Clinton administration. And this allowed duty-free export for many African nations to the US in many different industries. This actually helped us early on in the project stages when we were starting. But later here, recently in 2017, we ran up against a issue with locally produced products. Now, the main thing is to keep in mind that there's been a lot of lessons learned in foreign aid over the past decades. And one of the main things that Rwanda learned was that the secondhand exports that were coming into the country were really damaging their local market. And this included our artisan shoemakers that we were working with. This was something that we knew from the onset. We knew that when a free pair of shoes was given to anybody in that local context, not only was that often kind of just a foreign thing, right? But that also undercut the prices of the artisan shoemakers that we were working with. And so, this isn't unique to the footwear industry. Kenya and many other East African, sub-Saharan nations used to actually make their own clothing too. in Rwanda, there's only one factory that actually manufactures for the local domestic market, and I think only 2 total at this time that is even operating at all. All of those African countries basically faced this decision. Should we basically tariff the imports and the secondhand imports to help our local economies start to operate again, and so that prices could rise? Or do we risk losing the duty-free privilege of AGOA? And unfortunately, the current administration in the US threatened to lift that for most of the countries, actually all of the countries, and all of the countries except for Rwanda backed out. And so now we're in a situation in which Rwanda is sticking to their guns, and they're going to focus on their local economy. This is good for our artists and shoemakers, again, because prices can go up, and hopefully the volume of the secondhand goods that are flooding markets, as you can even see in this picture. I think in Kenya they're known as the clothing of dead white people, actually. That's what the word translates to. And I mean, and they actually use that term because there's a little bit of animosity there because they know what it did to their industries. Now, there's a mass surplus of this in our consumer society, and there are even nonprofits that try to really perpetuate this, and it's a very delicate thing. Our project operates every time we go to a festival. We have to basically communicate that we operate in the tension of this because there's a right way to give and there's a wrong way. There's handouts, right, which is kind of a free thing that just it also is not egalitarian. You're always you have like a superiority complex in a way to be able to give to somebody instead of working together economically. So the better approach that we've seen a lot of organizations do is to actually make sure that these do not go right into markets, but rather through entrepreneurs, people that can actually get them at a lower price and then mark them up and sell them. Now, even that puts strain on local producers. So that's why we're still with the artists and shoemakers at this point. We're at a crucial time of trying to understand what would be the best option for them going forward. I have a few quotes here that I wanted to share. A scholar by the name of Andres Windmeer, he's with Catholic University of America, he said in Poverty, Inc., that our donations have an unpredictable impact on the local economy, and that wreaks havoc on a lot of businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses. He really couldn't say that loud enough. There's also another person that was interviewed with Partners International, a Haitian man, who talked about how Tom's shoes in their marketing, when it was said that basically in their marketing it said that they would like to supply people with shoes for the rest of their lives, he responded by asking, well, why, that implies that they would like people to be without shoes for the rest of their lives so that they could fill this, hole. It's almost as if in some of our approaches we are dependent on the recipient of aid or the beneficiary to stay where they are. And this is a big problem and something we subtly and sometimes not so subtly confront in the U.S. through our product. Again, this is paternalism, and it's the old way of doing development. One of the main things that we really are focusing on now with our project is, again, not necessarily scaling to a large scale kind of production model, which is very common for footwear. That's kind of our main limitation. We learned that in the footwear industry, you need to have a very big production setup to create a lot of volume of shoes, and that takes a lot of investment and a lot of time. So we're at a place where we're focusing on the potency of our model, and again, a lot of patient capital, some time and patience to research again what the artisan shoemakers are are able to do. And currently, our D for D model, which at one time was just at the end of our sales season, all one big lump sum. Now we're actually spreading out over the course of 6 to 8 months or so. And that's a smaller amount, but the artists and shoemakers are much more able to use that the right way, using it in a sustainable way because it's predictable for them as it comes through. Theodore Dalrymple is also interviewed in Poverty Inc. and I think says something that is really important for those of us who are either development practitioners or going into business in which, on a global scale or others will be affected. Compassion sometimes is a it's not just a vehement expression of a point of view, but rather it is taking the time to consider the practical effects of what we're proposing. This is just really key because, again, we see things, we react to things in the media or wherever that might be without actually researching for ourselves or experiencing for ourselves what it is behind that. So to talk a little bit more in detail now about our actual impact, I wanted to have us focus on something from our annual report, which shows the median wage of the average Rwandan versus a shoemaker. And you can see that monthly median wages are at the bottom kind of for reference, but the annual median wages, you can see this is actually both like at the poverty line. The artisan shoemaker is even more below the annual median wage for the average Rwandan. This is from 2015. We had about $2,100 of a D for D that went back to Rwanda. We sent back through our supply chain manager, John, and John basically divided it by 6, and that was for 5 artisan shoemakers and then a women's group that we worked with. You can see, again, the blue is just showing you how that D for D that year put them in an incredible position. And just for a frame of reference, that was $350 per group or per family, basically. And $350 on the Rwandan economy is about 8 months worth of rent in that economy. So it went quite far that year. That is, again, there's the number that we were able to generate in that year through the sales of the tire footwear. And you can see the women's group that actually were weaving baskets out of recycled shipping straps. It was a perfect complementary good that we used that year. And this is why we chose to include them for sure for the D for D. The recycled shipping straps are all plastic, so they're very durable. And that was another plus. And a secondary thing that this year that also took us by surprise was that the artisans reported that on the local market, they had more sales and more customers than they had in years past. So we looked a little more closely, and we found that just by virtue of our quality standards and the fact that we were taking some time to give them feedback, and even though we allowed them to design, I mean, we never imposed our own designs, but we allowed them to lead us and guide us in what they were selling and then innovate from there. They were able to basically increase their local sales. And you could see the main outcome here. This is Awamaria in the middle, and Josephine over here. These are the wives of 2 of our artisans, Fidel and Claude. They both have been able to use the D for D, basically our cash transfers that are direct dividends from the sales of the footwear, and they were able to open their own businesses. Maria is on her second business, but she had started a business, just a local cafe, and that's something that they wouldn't have had the opportunity to do otherwise. Josephine, faced with a little choice, but to also get involved in the local market of the handouts, she was starting a clothing business for infants and toddlers. And that has been going for over a year now, going pretty well. And you can see down below, this is just an example of where we sell the sandals and how easy it is to basically, we literally load up a Honda Fit and we go to festivals. Part of this, the takeaway is that individually, we and you could do a lot more than you might think when you're encountering certain things in the world, and things like this that can be used to promote a message or a mission. This is kind of the result of it. Again, we wanted to put potency before profit, potency of our message and of the product itself. Kind of to again reiterate the limitations. Free enterprise is not obviously a cure-all. It's something that is going to work better in certain contexts, certain governments, certain countries than others. We found that in my studies and also in Poverty Inc., this is also the conclusion here, and they refer to it as the ladder of prosperity or ladder to prosperity. This is really what we should be after ultimately as development practitioners. Legal protection, from theft and violence, justice in the courts, the ability to get legal title to one's land and freedom to start and register a business, and the ease at which to do that. And of course, links to wider circles of exchange. These are things we all take for granted in our democratic society and our free society. And I think that it's really helpful to look for ways to kind of bypass in countries in which these things are still developing. And sometimes we can't touch these either as entrepreneurs or even in development because this is up to the country ultimately. But it's, for instance, with Rwanda's, their land tenure laws actually have facilitated a situation in which one of our artisans, Francois, was able to buy his own property after just 2 years of working with us. That's another big success story that I wanted to bring up. Francois now has been able to leave the cycle of rent, and he has his own property now. Francois is down in the corner here. This is John in the middle. He's our supply chain manager. And these are some of the other artisans, as we did a recent training with an Ethiopian consultant to try to work on the footwear that we're now moving towards, possibly. I kind of want to just conclude right now with just a reflection that Bill Easterly had kind of left me with this to think about. Economic and political freedom, individual liberty, and entrepreneurship is kind of the environment that facilitates the elements that make up that ladder to prosperity. In Poverty Inc., the main takeaway is more so that as long as the aid establishment remains unchanged, developing countries will most likely also remain unchanged and remain the same. So we would like to just put forth that an alternative in the interim is to consider authentic relationship in a business model, to not just operate a business on a large scale, but to get your hands dirty in a lot of research, get on the ground and really get to know whom you're working with, and let them lead and teach in that process. I feel that leveraging business to generate wealth can uphold dignity of producers. It can lead to cultural commerce that's mutually beneficial. And it can also help to reshape our thinking in America of what has formerly been very paternalistic. Easterly mentioned 10 years ago in a talk that nobody is individually accountable for any one result. Nobody is individually responsible for any one result. That's a big problem in the aid industry, unfortunately. A lot of times organizations can go about things and not be held accountable. But if you're in business, When you're running a business, every partner is a shareholder. Everyone has a stake in that, and everyone is accountable to each other. That's ultimately what the Atinga Project, as a case study, can bring, I think, to the field of international development and free enterprise. Thanks so much.
I'm just curious about the D for D idea. How does that differ from a bonus that one might get in a for-profit here in the U.S.?
That's a great question. A lot of people would ask, is this just profit sharing? And the answer to that is it is completely different in our view, because profit sharing is usually done to incentivize. It's usually done kind of as a reward kind of thing. Not necessarily a cat and mouse thing, but I mean, we see that in most cases that's, more of to motivate workers and whatnot. The D for D is actually a unconditional cash transfer, basically, or just an unconditional dividend, a distribution of our earnings. And we make sure that that's fully clear, that there's nothing expected in return. And furthermore, back to the relationship part of things with our artisans, shoemakers, there's more there than just the money, because they understand that it's up to our decision making and how many sandals we produce and sell and can sell. That's what determines that D for D. So it's kind of a way for all of us to work together. And again, ultimately, we reiterate that it's on them to decide how best to meet their own needs, which is kind of the key takeaway on that. Yeah.
I guess I feel like this strays dangerously close to paternalism, simply because, in the past when I've gotten bonuses, nobody told me how to spend it either. And typically it was, the company made this much money, so we're going to share it with everybody. I don't know why wouldn't you maybe use some of the for-profit language to really emphasize that there is that dignity, that we see you as business partners and not just recipients of aid? Yeah.
Well, it kind of goes back a little bit to Give Directly also, and what they're trying to prove. It really was fitting in our model against paternalism, as we would work with customers on a daily basis in the U.S. We would be able to not sound paternalistic when we say, hey, we're the big guys with the business and the big bucks. Hey, we're importing this and we're selling it at a higher price. That's very business minded. We needed to challenge people kind of the opposite direction, to say, listen, we honor, again, dignity, honor, and humility. We honor the people we work with. We walk alongside them in their shoes. Walk a mile in their shoes is our main kind of tagline. And the key with that is, again, we need people to understand that people, it's not going to go to any specific thing that we dictate, because that would be extremely 100% paternalistic. Yeah. Of course, when you're operating within the framework, this framework shown here, when you're stuck with a framework like that, this is kind of what Poverty Inc. refers to as a Durkheimian fact, the social fact. Emil Durkheim, a sociologist, observed this over 120 years ago, that a social fact is something that basically defines our assumptions and our social norms, and it's kind of influences us very subtly. It's not something that we could be aware of, and that's kind of what we have to operate in when it comes to the aid system. So trying to operate outside of it, a lot of companies try to do that just by virtue of being a for-profit company and doing something different than the traditional structure that we see here. But yeah, I think it's still hard to escape it. I mean, you make a good point.
Can I ask another question then?
Please.
So my wife used to work for International Justice Mission, and they have offices all around the world. And one of the issues that they were always struggling with was, how much do you pay someone in country? How much do you pay a national? I'm guessing you don't get paid $2,000 a year, and yet $2,000 a year goes a lot farther in Rwanda than it does here in the U.S. So how does your business think about that? What you pay an American versus one of your African employees or providers?
Sure. Well, the whole point of being here to really put this in front of everybody is to reiterate that this is a very small scale business, and we actually worked with only interns basically. We had a year where, they were employees in 2016, but from year to year, we actually just operate to create that impact for the artisan shoemakers. Okay. We don't draw anything or pay anything to us as a social business, as Muhammad Yunus would define it. We are only repaying some of the initial investment that we put in. So that's kind of the point of the Atinga Project too, in terms of that business model, and why so many people in business early on when we pitched the project couldn't understand. What are you doing? And we say we're leveraging business, and this is what Muhammad Yunus is known for. He talks about use what business can do to actually create impact and generate something other than just wealth, for the shareholders and whatnot, So we are a benefit corporation in New York State. We almost were a certified B Corp, but we decided to just hold off on that because we didn't see the value at the time in making that expense, and instead put the money right back into the hands of the producers. So these are just a few little things. So thanks.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was absolutely inspiring to have watched Poverty Inc. and kind of get a little sad watching that this was the reality, and then have you as an example and your project as an example of not that. You talked a little bit about Tom's Footwear and what they kind of implicitly said in their 20-year plan of what they hope, is the reality so they can keep producing shoes. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about 5, 10, 20 years down the road, what do you hope this project becomes and what it does for the local communities that you're partnering with?
Sure thing, yeah. And I have that soundbite too, kind of verbatim from Poverty Inc. too about that. I'm glad you asked. For the Atinga Project, I can't really even say, because we're so research based, that we really are beneficiary led together. We all agree. The artisans. One of the things we do. We break bread together almost every year to reassess and look at the main issues. One year in 2016, it was that the government locally was really on this big hype thing to remove all informal activity, and we were, these artisan shoemakers work in the informal sector. That gets kind of to sustainability, and what I didn't talk about as much, but when we ask what's sustainable and what's sustainable going forward, well, it might sound pretty obvious to say this, but it's what works. It's what works for the artisan shoemakers. What works for the local people on a day-to-day basis. Now, you can try to anticipate policy changes, but this was one thing that we found, very quickly, that whenever there was wind of a new policy change or something that was going to be enforced locally at the local level, it was how do we as the interventionist make that not a problem for the people we work with? How do we intervene? But that's again kind of getting back into a paternalistic mindset. And so we during that time, and I hope I'm answering your question. I'm sorry. Yeah. During that time, we had to back off and actually look at, okay, what immediately is the threat? And we were already semi-formal with, by virtue of the company that we just created so that we could export the sandals. So that kind of helped protect the artisan shoemakers, and they continued to carry on their business. Some of them had to move a little bit, but one of the artisan shoemakers said to us when we were recently meeting with an Ethiopian consultant of a fair trade footwear factory in Ethiopia, thinking that this was going to be our next step. Mm-hmm. The artisan Claude, you saw his wife Josephine, said to us, "Oh, but if we go and all leave our markets, because they each operate in kind of different markets, kind of nearby, but they're operating in separate markets, how will we bring our customers with us? We're going to lose our customers locally there." And that's a huge risk. I mean, that kind of is the problem when you take a for-profit model, because a traditional for-profit model is high investment at first, right? And then, you're supposed to regain that, and you're supposed to have a real nice, neat and tidy business plan. Well, that's a little difficult, especially in a landlocked country in sub-Saharan Africa, and especially when exporting sandals or any goods for that matter is not always the easiest thing to build right into your cost of the goods that you sell. So, that's a great question, because it's something that we're basically together watching for the opportunity, and watching also for the climate in Rwanda to change, and see how things adjust now to this new tariff on the secondhand imports. Hopefully, it will mean that we will have an opportunity at some point to bring in some of the equipment needed to actually scale up to the next level, in which the artisans can make shoes and footwear locally for many of their own customers they already have. And that's something they've expressed that they'd like to do. So that's what we're hoping to do at some point at the right time.
I was going to ask, earlier in your lecture, you said that it started out with some artisans, but then it started to become like a family thing, and it kind of grew that way. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if Atinga had any policies on child labor, and what they are and how you guys view that.
Sure, that's great. So we, and I wish I could have more time to look into our baseline research, but if it is all on our website, very transparent, to go down to our baseline. Initial baseline surveys that we did in the community, and then also evaluations we did year after year. In all of that work, we were watching actually from the start, because we noticed the kids that were around, and we got to know the families, because when we were interviewing the artisan shoemakers, yes, we would have like kind of business meetings together at a separate location and whatnot, and pay transport and pay for lunch, and we all get together, and we'd really assess exactly what we needed to know numbers wise, and talk about all together why we needed to make adjustments, or what was that. Basically, we called it the magic number in terms of getting the cost down. It was kind of an economies of scale exercise to see how many raw materials could we source, number one, which is something I also didn't, I kind of left for this Q&A session. The raw materials and the supplies that the artisans use to produce our footwear, and the footwear that they use, is extremely inconsistent. And this has been one of the hardest things to kind of overcome. Our supply chain manager, whom my original co-founder passed off the baton to, basically, John, he actually was able to work with our project. And he also works for another nonprofit, but together we were able to pay his tuition to finish school. And he decided, because of this, to focus on procurement and really try to understand, well, why can't we get more of these raw materials into my country? And what can we do to try to overcome that? So that's a little bit of an aside, but back to your original question, in that initial baseline research, that was a question we had on our survey, I believe. And if it's not on the baseline, it was asked, because one of the artisans works out of his household. So the question was, do you have anything that you give your children to do for work or something like that? The answer is that we found that that artisan in particular, actually, his kids were there because he was actually out of school because he couldn't afford the school fee for that month or that term or something. I think it was less than a month, and I hope it was. But that was kind of our immediate indicator of, wow, this is one thing obviously he would probably spend the D for D on, and which he did later on. He's now been able to keep all of his kids consistently in school. So, I mean, in short, or in a long response there, it's not a concern at all whatsoever in terms of the relationships that I have. I mean, to be honest, he's like a brother to me, the supply chain manager. That's the thing, to be able to be on the ground and to develop relationships over the long term. You develop trust that is, something that a big company often will never be able to achieve. And therefore those things can go under the radar,
Mm-hmm.
So
as you guys like scale and get bigger, like you might have more partners. And so like I was just wondering what the balance would be, because you don't want to be paternalistic and tell the parents how to parent with their own kids. But then again, if they choose to use them as child labor, like would you at that point step in and be paternalistic, or would you allow them to do their thing?
Oh no, yeah, we would never want that to happen. So we would never, we'd never tolerate something like that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good stuff.
My question is this: what advice do you have for business students interested in getting involved with the development, and especially could you pay attention to entrepreneurs and how they can get involved more than just on the level of consumer, but also avoid coming across as paternalistic or having a savior complex when trying to find a need or an opportunity for their product?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think that goes back to where I started with my study abroad in Rwanda in 2011. Earlier today in Dr. Hale's class, I kind of advocated for studying abroad no matter what you're studying right now. And I advocated for doing that with a reputable and a good program in Rwanda. So a shameless plug for the GoEd Study Abroad program. Definitely check out the GoEd Study Abroad program, because their focus and their emphasis, they're also, I believe, a partner here with Azusa Pacific. They emphasize walking with the poor and understanding, again, that poverty is not just what we think of when we think of the typical poverty, but that poverty transcends, basically, it's an equalizer, if you could think of it that way. Because if none of us in this room will be or have been poor before, it's basically the universal state. And we see that also in the Beatitudes, and that's kind of where it's grounded, that blessed are the poor in spirit. I think that any person in business or whatever field you might be in benefits tremendously from that, confronting this void. And it's like sometimes hard to put to words, but if you're thinking of going into business to meet a need, Muhammad Yunus would say that unless you are, the more desperate you are, the more likely that you'll come up with those ideas. That's why there have been incredible ideas in the developing world. Sometimes they go overlooked, but I've met entrepreneurs. I've seen them in Rwanda. They have their own ideas for addressing their own problems. Local problems really can truly solve the local, local solutions can truly solve those local problems. So if that would be kind of my main focus for your question. Okay. I hope I answered that. But just focus on opportunities to relate just as much as you might focus on ideas that, you might catch yourself being, oh, this is me thinking I know what somebody else needs. Yeah, it's better to have a relationship, develop a connection, and actually learn directly like what somebody's needs are, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm actually with a group of students who just completed the GoEd program last fall. Great. So we spent a lot of time with John, and a handful of us got shoes made and stuff. So it's cool that you're here and that's a Wonderful. Part of our world's
Whoever
colliding.
Whoever asked about child labor, go ask her. She can vouch for us, huh?
Yeah, totally. Anyways, I just wanted to ask a question about employment. So how many total people are employed through Atinga, both in the U.S. and Rwanda?
Yeah, well, basically in Rwanda, see, it's a tricky question to just say employed, right. Because, it can be part-time, and whatnot. And going back to our chart, again, this kind of shows that blue is supplemental income that basically boosts their income, the income of the artisans that we work with. That's income that they otherwise would not have. And again, this is on top of what we've already paid. So that blue does not include what the business we give them. So just by virtue of doing business with them, that is another opportunity, to sell on the internet, for those sandals, not just locally, like you might have participated in there, but to actually sell them in a whole nother market. So it's 5 artisan shoemakers we work with, but that trickles down to about 15, last time we counted 18 people because of the family, how they use that together. Most of the art, again, you saw the wives of John, of Apollinaire and Claude.
Yeah.
You know, they will use that money to you know, use that for their own other auxiliary activities, but also we have like some other smaller products, not just the baskets, but wristbands. So Hitimana, Apollinaire's wife, will also cut wristbands for us. And so we're able to give business, I think, or give an opportunity to work to a range of those. You know, our core focus, though, has been the 5 artisan shoemakers for about 5 years now.
Okay.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to word that. We have some part-time staff in the U.S. just to help us out in festivals, but that's usually, again, just for a few festivals in the summer, and that's kind of how it goes. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.